What's good, guys? Super Orion is a character who is fairly underrated in the Fate community. Since his release, he's become one of my favorite characters in the franchise, but outside of soloing bosses and events, I feel like not a lot of focus is put on the character. He doesn't have a lot of fan art in particular, and this could be because Fate is a waifu game, but I think Oberon and Percival and stuff, since this year's events in JP, kind of disproves this narrative. And I feel like even now, after Lost Belt 5 has come out in America, he's not going to get a lot of attention. So that's all this video is really about, just a little bit of a gush piece over Orion. So without further ado, let's get into the video on why you should care about Super Orion.
Super Orion is just after releasing on the NA version of Fate Grand Order, so this is a pretty timely video to make it upload. As of recording of this, Super Orion was released 4 days ago on the server. Before we even get into this video, I gotta admit that I have a pretty big bias for the Servant, the original Orion unit being my first summon in the game that was a 5-star. As such, I've used them quite a lot, so I've become quite attached over the years. In addition to this, since its release, Super Orion has become one of, if not my favorite, male character in the game. And this is including servants from the entire franchise, so that is pretty biased in my opinion. The primary focus of this video is a dissection of Orion's character and story, and why I feel that this makes him extremely important in the world of Fate Grand Order. Although this isn't a why you should summon video, I do think is well worth your Saints quotes, as he is an incredibly powerful character in game. I am going to do a quick rundown on Orion's gameplay as a servant before moving into a discussion on his lore and the character. There will be spoilers in this section, so keep that in mind when listening if you care about that sort of thing. Gameplay. Super Orion is a Buster DPS servant with a twist. But don't worry, my fellow Buster meme enjoyers, he's still not that complicated to use. Super Orion primarily focuses on dealing massive damage with his face cards. This is done through the use of his Noble Phantasm and skills. His Noble Phantasm is a buff instead of an attack like usual DPS servants. This type of Noble Phantasm is typically reserved for support servants like Merlin or Scotty. After activating his Noble Phantasm, Orion turns into a crit monster. Even without buffs from other servants like Merlin or Koyanskaya, Orion does massive damage. Get used to critting for hundreds of thousands of damage on neutral enemies with Orion. Even with class disadvantage, Orion destroys his enemies. Due to the nature of his skills and Noble Phantasm, Orion is perfectly built for soloing bosses and challenge quests, being one of, if not the best solo servant in the game. Although I haven't put myself through the pain of it, he can even solo challenge quests like Dante's Prison Tower. Ryu Emerald has a video of Orion performing this feat, which is well worth the watch for the sheer insanity that this servant allowed. Although, you can imagine how long it takes to get the perfect run on such an event. Lore. This should go without saying, but Orion is based on the Greek hero of the same name. The Orion in Fate Grand Order is pretty much just a sanitized version of his original myth, similar to many other characters that appear in the franchise. Orion is the lover of Artemis in FGO, instead of traveling companion, friend, love interests like he is in the various versions of his myth. In Fate Grand Order, he is killed by Artemis after she mistakes him for someone else, similar to one of the many deaths of his in mythology. Orion in Fate, like many characters, is a hypocrite. He both hates the gods and how inhuman they are, and loves Artemis. This is pretty obviously two conflicting ideas. These ideas were never explored on his original servant.
However, during Lost Spell 5, this is pretty much the primary focus of Orion's character and story.
Surprisingly, Orion is an extremely important piece of Fate's lore. This can best be described by his two different appearances in Fate Grand Order. The original servant Orion is a very controversial servant, being both Artemis and Orion in one servant. The servant is primarily used for comic relief. Artemis is a love-obsessed yandere and Orion is a womanizer similar to Master Roshi. There are a number of different reasons why people dislike this servant. Typically this is centered around the portrayal of Artemis in the story and events. The servant is also not very powerful in game, which just adds fuel to the fire of people's ire. Super Orion, however, addresses these issues and in my opinion, salvages the characters of both himself and Artemis by recontextualizing their relationship. Super Orion makes his appearance in Lost Spell 5 Atlantis. During this story we discover that not only is Orion built different, just look at him, he is also the Grand Archer. This title alone elevates him above most servants in Fate Grand Order in terms of importance. In addition to this, the story of Orion in the Lost Spell centers around his relationship with Artemis, providing us with a deeper insight into their relationship. This is primarily done through his interactions with the Lost Spell version of Artemis. In the past, Orion was offered divinity by Artemis, however he turned her down, choosing to remain human even when offered immortality so that he will always remain the same version of himself that Artemis fell in love with. It becomes evident throughout the Lost Spell that Orion is a womanizer primarily because it is a coping mechanism caused by his doubts about the relationship. Although this does not excuse his womanizing ways, it provides a deeper insight into the mindset Orion has, still not being sure if he made the right choice in falling in love with her and promising her to love her forever. Due to the history of the Lost Spell, Orion and Artemis were unable to meet, and so she remained an emotionally distant goddess. Despite his womanizer and joker ways, during this Lost Spell, Orion gets his act together and decides that he must fulfill his promise to Artemis. Seeing the sorry state Artemis is in within the Lost Spell depresses Orion, as he is used to seeing her as her usual upbeat self. Seeing a version of her that is so different to his love is devastating to Orion. She has also been reduced to a weapon by those around her, nothing more than a tool. Despite having rejected the gods for being inhuman, Orion sees the humanity in Artemis. The Artemis terminal who interacted with Orion upon him entering the Lost Spell is able to gain humanity after Orion treats her as an individual instead of a tool, going so far as to betray the main terminal of Artemis and aid Chaldea even at the cost of her own life. The events of Lost Spell 5 cause Orion to sacrifice everything to ensure this version of Artemis was shot down. Orion only succeeds in shooting her down after sacrificing his life and his title as Grand Archer, realizing that he can't let Artemis, who is a heart like a human, continue to suffer in solitude. The Lost Spell version of Artemis, after receiving Orion's love, gains emotions, and accepting his feelings for her, allows herself to be killed. In the final moments, she observes Orion memories and sees her pan-human history self, asking Orion to save her if she ever lost her humanity. She realizes that she is jealous of this version of herself. Even though this would seem to be a selfless act on Orion's part, he himself acknowledges that it is selfish desire to not see one he loves suffering, even if that person is not the same as the version he knows. What's great about their relationship is that it is one of the only rebuttals to the theme of gods and humans cannot understand each other that Nasu writes in his stories. Gods are characterized by an alien mindset that has completely different values and morals when compared to humanity. This is what causes a lot of conflict between the gods and mortals in Fate, and is especially seen in the Lost Spells. Yet Orion, a human, and Artemis, a goddess, still fall in love with each other, despite being completely alien in existence, and Orion choosing to remain human, even if it strains the relationship, all because he felt that being a human who loved Artemis would be important.
proves that in this world, the only thing separating the gods and humans is that they are unwilling to try and understand each other. Conclusion. Simply put, my boy Super Orion is just built different. He takes two characters that were disliked and recontextualizes them, placing the gag relationship into a serious story. I personally think the results of that speak for itself. Since its release, Atlantis has become one of the stories people want adapted into an anime the most. Although this is far more than just the story of Orion and Artemis, their story plays a central role in that story, as without the destruction of Artemis, Chaldea would not reach Olympus. Super Orion is an extremely important character in the world of Fate, and is the quintessential example of fixing the lore of Soviets and Fate Grand Order. He isn't an alternate version of himself. He's just the bear if he remained a human. Artemis and Orion's relationship, despite its flaws, also describes how the relationship between the gods and humans in the Lost Belts is flawed. Arjuna, Alter, and Zeus never seek to understand the humans around them. As such, they become completely inhuman and separate from humanity. This inevitably leads to their failure, as despite seeming like incompatible existences, we know through Orion and Artemis that gods and humans can in fact reach a mutual understanding. I'd like to end this video with the dialogue Orion has for Artemis after finishing the Lost Belt, as I feel this bit of dialogue really encapsulates their relationship perfectly, and ties a nice bow on this story of Lost Belt 5.
アルテミスか。なんだ。そんな申し訳なさそうにするな。似合わないったらありゃしねえ。生前、俺もお前に殺されたみたいだし、これでおあいこだ。だろ？落ち込むお前を見てると調子狂うんだよ。はい、この話終わり。解散解散！